The mirror hung on the wall, an ancient relic, dusty and dull, hidden in the attic of an old Victorian mansion. Its tarnished frame, made of silver twisted into intricate patterns, looked as though it had been carved by hands long since buried. No one knew where the mirror had come from, not even the family that owned the mansion for generations. They only knew one thing: it was never to be touched. The whispers surrounding it were the stuff of old stories, cursed, haunted, a window to something dark and unnatural. Alice, a young woman with a curious heart, stood before the mirror, her reflection faintly visible in the cloudy glass. She had always been drawn to the unknown, to the forbidden. She found the mirror after rummaging through the forgotten attic, sifting through boxes filled with moth-eaten clothes and cracked porcelain dolls. There was something about the mirror that called to her, an inexplicable pull that gnawed at her curiosity. The first time she brushed the dust away from its surface, a strange chill ran down her spine. The surrounding air thickened, growing colder, as if the attic had suddenly been plunged into the depths of winter. She shivered but couldn't tear her eyes away. Beneath the grime, the reflection became clearer, yet it wasn't quite hers. There was something off. Her face stared back, but the eyes of those eyes were hollow, as though staring into endless voids. Shadows flickered behind her, shapes that weren't in the room, moving with unnatural grace. She blinked and stepped back, heart pounding in her chest. But when she looked again, everything seemed normal. Alice couldn't let it go. Night after night, she returned to the attic, each time staying longer, staring deeper into the mirror. She became obsessed, unable to shake the feeling that it wasn't just a reflection she was seeing. It felt like the mirror was looking back at her, waiting, whispering to her in a language only her subconscious understood. One night, driven by the weight of her obsession, she reached out and touched the glass. The moment her fingers made contact, an icy shock surged through her hand, spreading like fire up her arm and into her chest. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't move. The world around her blurred, and the reflection in the mirror twisted and contorted. Her own image dissolved, replaced by something grotesque. Corpses stood in her place, their flesh rotting, eyes sunken deep into their skulls. Their mouths hung open, silently screaming, while blood dripped from their tattered clothes. Behind them, the shadows moved again, but now they took shape, tall, gaunt figures with long, bony fingers, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. She could feel them, those figures, reaching through the mirror, their skeletal hands brushing against the surface, hungry for her touch. Alice yanked her hand back, stumbling away from the mirror. Her heart raced as the attic plunged into silence. But the mirror wasn't finished with her. A faint tapping echoed through the room. It started soft, like fingers gently rapping against the glass. Then it grew louder, more frantic, as if something on the other side was desperate to break through. Alice could feel her sanity unraveling as she listened to the tapping, unable to move, frozen in place by the terror coursing through her veins. Suddenly, the glass cracked. A jagged line splintered across the surface of the mirror, and with it, a deep, guttural voice emerged from the other side. It was a voice soaked in decay, echoing from a place beyond the grave. "You've seen us," it growled, each word dripping with malice. "Now, you belong to us." Alice tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The figures in the mirror became clearer, their skeletal hands pressing harder against the glass, distorting it, making it bulge as if the boundary between the worlds was thinning. The mirror pulsed with a sickly glow, and the tapping grew to a frenzied beat. Alice backed into the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her body shaking uncontrollably. But it was too late. The crack in the glass widened, and with a deafening shatter, the mirror exploded, sending shards flying in every direction. Alice shielded her face, feeling the sting of the glass slicing through her skin. When she opened her eyes, the room was still. The mirror was gone, its pieces scattered across the floor like broken bones. But the worst part wasn't the destruction of the mirror. It was the silence that followed. The figures were gone, but the air was heavy with their presence, and Alice could feel them inside her. Something had crossed over, something had been released, and now it was crawling beneath her skin, whispering in her ear, twisting her thoughts. She wasn't alone anymore. The dead had come through the mirror, and they weren't leaving. Alice's reflection remained in the shards scattered on the floor, but it wasn't her. The eyes in the glass were still hollow, and behind them, the gaunt figures waited, watching her from the other side. They had found their way into her world, and now there was no escape. The tapping had stopped, but in its place came a slow, steady drip, blood pooling from where the glass had cut her. As it spread across the floor, the shadows seemed to move with it, merging with the blood, slithering toward her like living things. This was just the beginning. The mirror had shattered, but its curse was only starting to unravel. Alice stood trembling, her back pressed against the cold attic wall. She could feel her heart thudding in her chest, each beat growing louder as the shadows swirled around her feet, thick and viscous, like blood that had gone cold. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. She was frozen, as if the shattered pieces of the mirror had taken root inside her, turning her into one of the lifeless figures she had seen in the reflection. Her mind raced. What had she unleashed? The air around her felt different, charged with a dark energy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The attic, once a place of forgotten trinkets and dusty memories, now felt alive with something ancient and malevolent. The silence was unbearable, so deep that her own breathing seemed like a violation of the stillness. She glanced down at her hands, and her blood ran cold. The cuts from the shards weren't deep, but the blood was wrong. It didn't flow like it should. It was thicker, darker, almost black, as if something had tainted her from the inside. She touched her arm where the icy jolt from the mirror had first pierced her. The skin there had started to darken, spreading out from her hand like ink under the surface. Suddenly, a noise shattered the silence. A slow, deliberate creaking, like old wood groaning under the weight of something heavy. Alice's eyes darted to the doorway of the attic, but no one was there. Yet she could feel it. Something was in the room with her, watching, waiting. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. One of the mirror shards, lying jagged on the floor, began to twitch. It scraped against the wooden floorboards, dragged by an unseen force. Alice's breath caught in her throat as the shard inched its way toward her, joining the others that lay scattered around her feet. One by one, they began to slide, their sharp edges gleaming in the dim light. They seemed to pulse with the same sickly glow that had radiated from the mirror before it shattered, and as they moved, they formed a crude circle around her, closing in like a noose. And then, out of nowhere, the whispering started. At first, it was faint, just a soft, unintelligible murmur, like voices too far away to understand. But the more Alice listened, the clearer it became. They weren't far away. They were right beside her, inside her head. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of overlapping voices, each one rasping and low, as if spoken from rotting throats. Asterisk, we see you. Asterisk. Asterisk, you belong to us. Asterisk. Asterisk, crossover with us. Asterisk. The words swirled around her, coiling like snakes in her mind. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it did nothing. The voices were inside her now, gnawing at her sanity, tearing at the edges of her thoughts. She could feel them pulling, dragging her closer to something unspeakable. Her eyes darted to the shards again. In each jagged piece, she could still see her reflection. But it wasn't her anymore. The face that stared back was pale, gaunt, and dead, eyes hollow, skin stretched thin over bones that looked ready to burst through. And behind that reflection, the shadows shifted, twisting and writhing like things alive. The skeletal figures from the mirror were there, looming, their long, bony fingers reaching for her through the fractured glass. Alice stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of old boxes, sending dust flying into the air. She had to get out. She had to escape whatever curse had come through that mirror. But the shadows, now alive and thick as tar, moved with her, seeping across the floor, climbing up her legs like a dozen icy fingers. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat as a bone-chilling cold gripped her lungs. The attic door suddenly slammed shut with a force that shook the entire room, sealing her in. Her breath quickened, turning to shallow gasps as panic took over. She had to move now, or she'd be lost to whatever was coming through that cursed mirror. In a desperate rush, she lunged toward the door, but the second she touched the handle, she felt it another presence. It was no longer just the shadows or the voices. Something was in the room with her, something that wasn't human. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of decay. She turned slowly, heart pounding, and saw a figure emerging from the largest shard of the mirror, stepping through the broken glass as though it was water. It was tall, towering, its limbs unnaturally long, its body wrapped in tattered robes that trailed to the ground like wisps of smoke. Its face, or what remained of it, was a mass of rotting flesh, sunken eyes burning with a pale, otherworldly light. It opened its mouth, a gaping maw that seemed to stretch impossibly wide, and from it came a sound like the wail of the damned. The voices, all of them, screamed through that mouth, filling the room with an agonized roar that rattled Alice's very bones. And then it spoke directly to her. Asterisk, come with us, child of the mirror. Asterisk. Its voice was like the grinding of stones, deep and hollow. Alice's body moved against her will, her feet dragging across the floor, pulled toward the figure. She fought it, clawing at the ground, but her body no longer obeyed her commands. The closer she got to the figure, the colder the air became, until it felt like the blood in her veins was freezing solid. Her vision blurred, and in those final moments before her mind succumbed to the overwhelming darkness, she realized the truth. The mirror hadn't shown her the dead. It was the dead, and now they had claimed her as one of their own. The attic was silent again, but the mirror broken as it was continued to pulse with a faint, eerie light, as if it still hungered for more. More souls, more victims, more lives to pull into its cursed world. And somewhere, far beneath the house, the dead stirred, waiting for the next curious soul to stand before the mirror of the dead. The moment Alice's body fell to the ground, her limbs stiffened like a marionette with its strings cut, and the attic plunged into a stillness that felt suffocating. The shadows that had crawled across the floor dissolved into the wood, disappearing as if they had never been there. For a brief, terrible second, it was over, but Alice was still conscious, trapped within her own mind, unable to move. She could feel her heartbeat slowing, growing fainter, until it was barely a whisper in her chest. Cold spread from her hands to her legs, seeping through every part of her like ice, freezing her from the inside out. Her vision darkened, the world fading to black, but she remained painfully aware. She wasn't alone. Inside that darkness, she could feel them, the dead, the lost souls that had been drawn into the mirror before her. Their presence was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. She heard their whispers again, no longer faint but now clear and insistent, a maddening chorus that filled every corner with her mind. Join us, asterisk. But something was different. Alice wasn't merely a victim anymore. The shadows, the voices, the presence of the rotting figure, they weren't just pulling her into their world. They were making her one of them. She wanted to scream, to claw her way back to the light, but her body had been stolen from her, her soul now a passenger in this new vessel. The shadows slithered through her veins, darkening her skin, pulling her deeper into the void. She felt herself changing, her consciousness stretching thin like a thread pulled taut, ready to snap. And then it did. Her eyes opened, but they were no longer hers. The gaunt, skeletal figures from the mirror had taken root in her soul, twisting her thoughts into something dark and monstrous. She rose from the floor, but her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet controlled by unseen hands. Her reflection caught her gaze, but it wasn't Alice who stared back from the shards. It was something else. Her once vibrant eyes were now black pits of nothingness, cold and lifeless, her face hollow and pale. The Alice that had stood before the mirror was gone, consumed by the mirror's curse, replaced by the undead creature that now wore her skin like a costume. She stepped toward the shattered glass, feeling the pull of the mirror's call, and in her hollow reflection, the gaunt figure smiled. She was theirs now, body and soul, a servant to the cursed mirror, a vessel for the dead who had been trapped for centuries. And then, the attic door creaked open. The sound echoed through the still air, a reminder that the world outside continued. unaware of the horror festering within the old mansion's walls. A faint light from the hallway spilled into the room, revealing the devastation caused by the mirror's curse, the broken shards, the blood that had dried into dark streaks on the floor, and Alice, standing in the center of it all, her lips curling into a cold, hollow smile. She turned, her movements unnervingly slow, and saw him, a man, probably in his mid-30s, who had come looking for her. Her boyfriend, David. His face was etched with concern, his voice barely a whisper as he called her name. "Alice? Are you okay? What happened?" But Alice didn't respond. She tilted her head slightly, her hollow eyes fixing on him with a cold, predatory intensity. David took a step forward, confused and worried, unaware of the horror that had taken his girlfriend. He didn't see the darkness that rippled beneath her skin, the way her hands twitched with an unnatural hunger. David's concern turned to fear as he stepped closer. "Alice? What's wrong?" Alice's smile widened unnaturally so, her lips stretching far too thin. The shadows beneath her skin writhed, and with a sudden, jerking movement, she lunged at him, faster than he could react. Her hands, now claw-like and cold, gripped his throat with an unnatural strength, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. David gasped, his hands clawing at hers, trying to pry her off, but it was useless. He saw it now, the blackness in her eyes, the absence of humanity. This wasn't Alice. Not anymore. The mirror had claimed her, and now it wanted him too. With a final, gurgling breath, David's body went limp in her grip. She let him fall to the ground, his body collapsing in a lifeless heap at her feet. The attic was silent once more, but the hunger in Alice, or what had become of her, had only just begun. She turned her head slowly, her empty eyes gazing into the darkness beyond the attic door, sensing the presence of others in the house. She could hear their breaths, their heartbeats warm, living things just waiting to be claimed by the mirror. As she stepped out of the attic and descended the stairs, her movements smooth and deliberate, the old house creaked in response. The mirror's whispers filled the silence once again, promising more souls, more bodies to devour. And behind her, the shattered glass pulsed faintly, waiting for the next curious soul to fall into its deadly trap. The mirror of the dead would never be satisfied. It would keep feeding, keep taking, until there was nothing left but an empty world filled with hollow, twisted reflections. And Alice, now the mirror's chosen harbinger, would ensure that no one ever escaped its grasp.